Some people break loud. You hear them coming apart, the shouting, the weeping, the whole town leaning in to watch. And some people break so quietly that you'd swear they were made of iron, right up until the morning you find out they were made of paper the whole time, and the only thing holding them upright was a kind of pride so fierce it could pass for strength in bad light. I've thought a long while about which is the braver way to fall. I still don't know. But I know this. I once watched a woman walk into a valley in the last warm week before winter, wearing a dead man's name and a dress she'd mended so many times the mending had its own mending, and she looked every soul in that town dead in the eye and dared us to feel sorry for her. Nobody did. She wouldn't have allowed it. There was only one man among us who looked at that armor and saw what was underneath it. And what he did about it is the reason I'm telling you this at all, because it changed him, and it changed her, and God help me. It's the reason I stopped running from my own life. If you've ever stood tall on the outside while everything inside you was coming down, this one's for you. Stay with me to the end. It's the end that matters. She went down in the mud outside Havorson's Mercantile, and the whole street stopped breathing. I was across the way, up on the loading rail of Coyle's freight barn with a pencil behind my ear and my ledger open on my knee, and I saw the exact moment her boot caught the edge of a plank someone had thrown down over the worst of the wet. Her ankle turned. Her arms went out. And for one long second the fine straight line of her, the line she'd walked in on not 5 minutes before, chin up, gray skirts held out of the muck by 2 fingers like the mud itself ought to apologize, that whole line broke, and she pitched forward into the filth of the main road with a sound I'll never forget. Not a cry, a grunt, small and ugly and human, punched out of her by the ground. You'd have thought the street would rush her. It didn't. That's the thing about a person who's spent every minute since arriving making it plain she'd sooner die than be touched. When she fell, we all leaned in and not one of us moved. She got up alone. I want you to understand how she did it because I put it in my ledger that night and I've read it back 100 times since. Most folks who fall in the mud scramble. Hands and knees a-flailing. She didn't. She stayed down on one knee a moment with her head bowed, and I watched her breathe 3 breaths. I count things, it's a sickness with me. And then she planted one hand flat in the mud and she rose. Slow, deliberate. Like the getting up was a thing she was choosing rather than a thing her body was managing. She came up with her whole left side brown and ruined, her sleeve black to the elbow, mud on her jaw, and she reached down with 2 fingers, picked up the small carpet bag that had flown from her grip, straightened her spine 1 vertebra at a time, and walked into Havorson's as though the road had merely been rude to her, and she had decided to forgive it. Behind me, old Coyle spat and said, "Lo, there goes trouble in a good hat." The hat wasn't good. That was the joke of it. Up close later I'd see the felt was worn shiny at the brim, and the ribbon had been turned so the faded side wouldn't show. But from a distance, with her carrying it like that, you'd have sworn it came from a shop window in Denver. That was the first hour I knew her. That was Delia Rourke. I should tell you who I am, or you won't trust me, and this is a story that lives or dies on trust. My name's Wesley Pratt, and at the time of this I was 24 and hearing out my back to whoever in the valley needed a fence mended or a herd moved or a barn raised, which is a polite way of saying I was a man with no place of his own and no intention of getting one. I kept a ledger, the one I've mentioned, but I didn't keep it for money. I kept a column for what I owed and a column for what was owed to me, and I don't mean coin. I mean the other kind. The night old Coyle let me sleep in the hay when I'd nowhere else, that went in the owed to him column. The morning I fixed Widow Ash's stove and wouldn't take her egg money, that went in the other. I've been keeping that ledger since I was 17, since the winter I ran, and if you want the short of it, I ran from a farm and a father who was dying slow and a mother who was already worn to the bone from nursing him, and I told myself I was going for work and I never went back, and he died in the March and I heard about it in April in a town 200 miles off, and I did not go to the burying. I put that in the ledger too. Some debts you write down knowing you'll never square them. You write them so you don't get to forget. So when I tell you I watched Delia Rourke the way a starving man watches a lit window, understand that I had my reasons. I knew a runner when I saw one because I was one, and she was the first person I'd ever met who plainly, ferociously would not run. It made me hate her a little. It made me can't look away. She'd come in on the Tuesday freight, which was how I came to be watching at all, since I unloaded for Coyle on Tuesdays. Word went around her before her boots did. Widow. Come to claim the Rourke place up the mountain. Which meant nothing to me until Coyle explained it meant the old Ambrose claim. A failed silver prospect turned failed homestead turned nothing at all, a 2-room cabin and a stove and 40 acres of rock and lodgepole, a full day's climb up the switchbacks, with the first cabin ceiling half fallen in from the snow load 2 winters back. Her husband had bought the paper on it, sight unseen from a man in a saloon, the way men buy dreams. Then her husband had died, and here she was to live in the dream. She'll last a fortnight, Coyle said, and everybody agreed. And I wrote in my ledger they say a fortnight and I underlined say, because I'd already seen her get up out of the mud. The town's name was Harlow's Bend, and it was the kind of place that decides who you are in your first 3 days and never revises. Delia Rourke it decided on in 1. She went to Havreson's for supplies and she bought them like a general: flour, salt, pork, coffee, lamp oil, a bag of dried beans, a keg of nails, a length of stovepipe. Reading off a list she'd made in a small clear hand, and she paid, and she did not haggle, and she did not once let on that the counting out of those coins was the counting out of nearly everything she had. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Then I just saw a woman with a list and I thought, well, she's got money. And I moved her down my private column from pitiable to irritating. And I was wrong on both counts, which I'd learn, which is the whole point. She needed her goods hauled up the mountain, and that's where the town got its first real taste of her. She asked Havorson who did hauling. He named the Beck boys. She sent for them. They came, 2 brothers, big and easy and not unkind, and they looked over the load and named a price, and it was a fair price for a day up and a day back. But her face went cold as a stove in July. "That is robbery," she said. The older Beck Ansel shrugged. "That's the mountain, ma'am. I'll not be gouged because I'm a woman and new." "You'll be gouged the same as any man be gouged," Ansel said. And there was a laugh in it, and it was the wrong thing to laugh at, and I saw her decide something. "Then I'll haul it myself," she said. And here's the thing, she meant it. She stood there in a ruined dress with mud drying on her jaw and 40 acres of rock a day's climb up, and a load a mule would think twice about. And she looked at that price, and she chose the mountain over the mercy of 2 men's fair wage, because the price felt like pity wearing a number, and pity was the one thing she could not buy. That was the day I understood her a little, though I didn't have the words yet. She wasn't cheap. She was armored, and the armor cost her more than the Becks ever would have. I hadn't laid eyes on the mountain man yet. He came into it that same afternoon, and I've thought since that it's fitting the 2 of them entered my telling on the same day, because they were the 2 ends of the same rope, though neither knew it. His name was Gideon Ware, and he lived alone up past the tree line on the north face, and he came down into the bend maybe 6 times a year for powder and salt and coffee, and in between he trapped and cut timber and sold cordwood, and mostly he was a story the children told to scare each other. 12 feet tall if you asked a 6-year-old. Ate a horse once. Talked to the wolves. The truth was he was maybe 50, gray in the beard and quiet in a way that made loud men nervous, and he had hands like a slab of oak, and eyes. I'll come to the eyes. He was in Havreson's, at the back with a coil of trap wire and a sack of coffee beans, when Delia made her stand about the price, and I was in the doorway watching, and so was half the town by then. And when she said I'll haul it myself, and the Becks laughed and turned to go, most everybody in that store laughed with them. The soft, mean, comfortable laugh of a crowd that has already written a woman off and is enjoying the writing. Gideon Ware didn't laugh. I happened to be looking at him and not at her, which is how I saw it, and I don't know that anyone else did. He'd gone still over his coffee sack, and he was watching her, and his face, nothing moved in it. But his eyes went over her quick once top to bottom, and I saw them stop. Not on her face, on her hands. Her hands were shaking. Not much. You'd have missed it unless you knew to look, and he knew to look. She had them folded in front of her, and they were trembling, a fine tremble, the tremble of a body that has decided to be brave a little past the point the body can afford it. And Gideon Ware looked at those trembling folded hands, and something crossed his face that I'd call sorrow if sorrow were a plainer thing. And then it was gone, and he set down his coffee and paid and left without a word to anybody, and I thought no more of him for a week. But I wrote it down. The mountain man watched her hands. I didn't know why I wrote it. Some part of me was already keeping the ledger on this. She didn't haul it all herself in the end. She hauled what she could, and she hired a single skinny mule from the livery for a week at a rate that even the liveryman's conscience made him lower once he'd looked at her. And she made 2 trips up and 1 down over 4 days, and she got maybe 2/3 of her goods to the cabin and left the nails and the stovepipe cached under oilcloth halfway up because the mule wouldn't take the last grade with the weight. I know all this because on the 4th day I was up on the north switchbacks myself, running down a stray heifer of widow ashes that had gone wandering, and I came around a bend in the aspens, and there she was, coming down empty, leading the drooping mule, and there was a child with her. I'll say that again, because it stopped me the way it stopped me then. There was a child. A little girl, maybe 6, in a coat 2 sizes big and a wool cap pulled to her eyebrows, trudging down the mountain trail with a stick in her hand, poking at things, the way children do, and Delia Rourke had her by the other hand and was matching her small steps with a patience I hadn't seen in the woman at the mercantile. And this is the part, she was talking. Softly. Some story or song, I couldn't hear the words, only the shape of them, low and warm, and the child was laughing at whatever it was. And Delia Rourke's face, which I had only ever seen set like a fence post, was open, just for that stretch of trail. Open and tired and tender. Then she saw me and it closed, snap like a book. "Ma'am," I said and touched my hat. "You're the freight man's boy," she said, not a question. She'd catalogued me on Tuesday and filed me away. "The one who watches." That landed. "I'm Wes Pratt," I said. "I do for folks around the valley, fences, herds. That heifer up there's widow ashes, I'm bringing her down." The little girl looked up at me with enormous serious eyes and said, "Are you a cowboy?" "June," her mother said, quiet. "I'm most of one," I told the girl, and she seemed satisfied with most. Delia Rourke was looking at me the way you look at a dog you haven't decided about. "If you're going up," she said, "there's a cache of goods under oilcloth at the 3rd switchback, nails and pipe. It's mine. I'd take it kindly if you left it be." Which was a strange thing to say to a stranger, and I understood it later. She was so braced for the world to take from her that she got the no in first, before I'd offered a yes. She was arming against a theft I hadn't thought of. "I'll leave it be," I said. "I could carry it up for you, though. I'm going that way and I've got 2 hands." And there it was. The cold came down over her like a shudder. "We manage," she said. "Come along, June." They went past me down the trail, the mule sighing, the child throwing one look back over her shoulder, and I stood there with Widow Ash's heifer bawling somewhere above me, and I felt, I'll be honest, I felt slapped. I'd offered a kindness and she'd taken it for an insult. I was young enough to think that was about me. It wasn't about me. It was never once about me. I know that now, but it took the winter to teach me. The snow came early that year. First of it the 3rd week of October, a dusting that melted by noon, then a real fall the last day of the month that stuck on the high ground and never fully left. And with the snow, the whole shape of the town's talk about Delia Rourke changed, went from mockery to a kind of grim betting. "She's still up there," the men would say at Coyle's, meaning it as a marvel and a doom both. "Nobody's seen her since the 5th. She came down twice in November that I know of, once for lamp oil and once for flour, and each time she came alone, no child, and each time she looked a little more like the mountain had gotten a grip on her. Thinner. There's a particular thin that isn't about vanity or fashion, a thin that's about the body eating itself to keep the fire going, and I'd seen it before, on my own mother the last time I saw her. And when I saw it starting on Delia Rourke's face at the Mercantile in the middle of November, something in my chest turned over. But you couldn't say a word to her. God knows if you tried. Mrs. Havorson, who was a decent woman, put up a basket once, a ham, some jars, a knitted thing for the child, and set it by while Delia was buying her flour, and said, easy as she could, just some odds we've extra of, take them up for the little one. And Delia Rourke looked at that basket like it was a coiled snake. We don't need charity, she said. It isn't. We don't need it. And she paid for her flour, and she walked out and left the basket sitting there, and the whole store watched her go, and Mrs. Havorson's face was red and hurt, and behind the counter her husband muttered something about proud fools freezing, and I wanted to knock his teeth in, and I didn't know why. I knew why. It was my mother. It was the March I didn't come home. Delia Rourke had a way of standing in a doorway that made me feel every debt in my ledger at once. Here's where Gideon Ware comes back in, and here's where the first part of this has to end, because it ends on the thing that broke it all open. It was the first week of December, and a storm was coming. You could smell it, that iron and cold smell, and the sky over the north face had gone the color of a bruise, and I was down at Coyle's helping stack the last of the cordwood under cover before it hit, and Gideon Ware came down off the mountain. That was wrong, and everybody felt it was wrong. He didn't come down in December. He laid in his supplies in the fall, and you didn't see him till the thaw. But here he came, down the north road on foot with his long stride, no sled, no load, nothing to trade, and he came straight to Coyle's yard where the men were, and he stopped, and he said without any greeting at all, in a voice like gravel under water, "The woman on the Ambrose claim, anybody been up?" Nobody had. "There's a child," he said. "There is," Coyle said. Gideon Ware looked at the bruised sky over the north face, and then he looked at all of us, at the whole comfortable yard of us stacking our wood before our storm, and I have never in my life felt so weighed and found wanting as I did under that look, and I hadn't even done anything yet. That was the trouble. None of us had done anything. That was the exact trouble. "Her chimney's not drawn smoke in 2 days," he said. "I can see her roof from my ridge. 2 days, no smoke." And the yard went very quiet, and the first fat flakes of the storm came sideways through the lantern light, and old Coyle said, "Maybe she went down valley. Maybe she left." "Her mule's in my paddock," Gideon Ware said. "Came down on its own 3 nights ago, halter still on it." He let that sit. "She's not gone anywhere. She's up there with no mule and no smoke and a storm coming, and she's got a little girl." I had my ledger in my coat. I could feel it against my ribs. Every debt in it, every unsquared line, the March I didn't come home, my mother's face gone thin, and here was a woman gone thin on a mountain with a child, 2 days no smoke, and a whole town of us standing in the falling snow doing the arithmetic of whose business it was. Gideon Ware didn't wait for us to finish the sum. "I'm going up," he said, and turned, and I heard myself say loud over the wind before I'd decided to, "I'm coming with you." He looked back at me, those eyes. I've been calling them the mountain man's eyes for a week in my head without knowing what I meant, and now I knew they were the eyes of a man who has already lost the one thing that mattered and has decided, quietly, that he will not stand and watch it happen to somebody else while he has legs to climb. I didn't know his story yet. I'd learn it up there in the dark. But I saw it in him then, plain as smoke, and I picked up a lantern. "Then move," he said. "We've got maybe 4 hours of trail before it closes." And we went up into the storm. The trail closed on us at the second switchback, and we climbed it anyway. I have never been so cold before or since. The storm came down off the peak like it had a grudge, and the snow wasn't falling so much as flying, sideways and stinging, and the lantern I carried threw a little useless yellow ball of light that the dark ate the moment it left the glass. Gideon Ware went ahead of me, and I followed his back the way you follow the last thing in the world you can see. He didn't hurry and he didn't slow. He climbed like the mountain was a debt he was paying off a step at a time, and I understood, somewhere on that grade with my lungs full of knives, that this was a man who knew exactly how to move through the thing that was trying to kill us, and that without him I'd have been dead in an hour, and I'd have deserved it for a fool. We didn't talk much. You couldn't in that wind. But once, sheltering a minute in the lee of a great fallen lodgepole to get our breath, he said something and I've kept it. "You climb like a man paying for something," he said. "So do you," I said. He looked at me a moment in the lantern light, snow crusting his beard white so he looked older than the mountain, and he said, "Everybody worth a damn is paying for something." And then he got up and we went on, and I put that in my ledger later, in the column I keep for things that turn out to be true. I learned his story in pieces over that climb and that night, and I'll give it to you here plain, because it's the key to everything he did. Gideon Ware had come to the mountain 20 years before with a wife and a daughter. He'd built the cabin on the north face with his own hands. And one winter, this would have been 15 years back, the diphtheria came up the valley the way it did, and it took his daughter in 3 days, a girl of 7, and his wife followed her inside the month, less from the sickness than from the after of it, from the not wanting to stay. And Gideon Ware had buried them both on his ridge, and he had not, in 15 years, come down off that mountain for any reason but powder and salt. And he had not, in 15 years, let himself care one straw what happened to a soul in Harlow's Bend. Till he looked out from his ridge one December morning and saw a chimney that had stopped drawing smoke, on a claim where he knew there was a little girl. He didn't tell me all this in a rush. He told me a piece at the fallen log, and a piece at the third switchback where we dug Delia's cached nails and stovepipe out from under a foot of snow, and Gideon strapped the pipe across his back without a word because he'd already reckoned what a stovepipe up there might mean, and a piece by the fire later. But I'm giving it to you now all at once, because I want you to understand what was climbing that mountain. It wasn't a good Samaritan. It was a father who'd lost a daughter to a winter, climbing through a winter toward another man's little girl, and every step of it must have been like walking back into the worst room of his life. That's what mercy costs sometimes. It costs you your own graves, dug up and walked through again. He paid it without a word of complaint. I've tried to be that kind of man ever since. I mostly fail, but I've tried. We reached the cabin past midnight, and my heart went down into my boots, because the man was right, no smoke, and worse, the door stood a hand's width open, banging in the wind, snow drifted across the threshold and into the front room. Gideon shouldered it wide and we went in, and the cold inside was nearly the cold outside, which told its own story, and I got the lantern up, and there they were. They were in the back room, the only room with a whole ceiling, on the one bed, and Delia Rourke was sitting up against the headboard with the child in her arms and every blanket and coat and rag in that cabin heaped over the both of them, and she had a fireplace poker in her fist, raised, aimed at the door at us, and her eyes were huge and black and fever-bright and half out of her head, and she said, in a voice like a scrape of dry wood, "You'll not take her, you'll not." She didn't know us. She thought we were the mountain come to collect. She was so far gone with cold and hunger and 3 days of holding a fever off her child by main force of will that she'd stopped being able to tell rescue from ruin. And even then, this is the thing. This is the whole thing. Even then, at the absolute end of herself, she raised a poker to defend her girl. The armor didn't come off. Not even there. It went all the way down to the bone. "Ma'am," Gideon said, and he stopped in the doorway and put his empty hands out where she could see them, and he made that gravel voice as soft as it could go. "Ma'am, we're from the Bend. We come up on account of your smoke. Nobody's taking anybody. That your fire gone out." She stared at him. The poker shook. Behind and below it, the little girl made a sound, a thin, wet, wrong sound, a sick child's cough, and I saw Gideon Ware flinch at that sound like he'd been struck, and I knew he was hearing another child, 15 years gone. June's got the croup, Delia said, and her voice cracked clean in half on the child's name, and the poker came down an inch. I couldn't, the wood ran out, 3 days. I burned the chairs. I burned the, she stopped. She was rationing even her words now, even her breath. I couldn't keep it lit. You kept her warm 3 days with no fire, Gideon said. Not a question. He said it like a fact he was laying at her feet, like a thing she'd done that he wanted her to hear said out loud by another human being before she died of doing it. You did that. And Delia Rourke, proud Delia Rourke, who wouldn't take a ham from Mrs. Havorson, who'd hauled her own goods up a mountain sooner than pay a fair wage, who'd left a charity basket sitting on a counter. Delia Rourke looked at this snow-crusted giant in her doorway telling her she'd done a thing right, and the poker fell out of her hand onto the bed, and her face came apart. Not loud. I told you at the start some people break quiet. She didn't wail. She just, the armor cracked right down the middle, and out of the crack came 15 years of things she'd never once let anybody see, and it came out of her in a whisper fast, like if she said it quick enough it wouldn't count. I can't do it. I can't do it alone. He left us. He didn't die brave. They told you he died and I let you think. He died in a gambling house in Cheyenne owing money I'm still paying. He bought us a ruin and he died and left me a paper and a child and nothing. And I couldn't let them see. If they saw, they'd take her. They take children off women who can't. I couldn't let one single soul see that you were scared, Gideon said. That I was finished, she said. And that was the truth she'd carried up the mountain. The truth, the pride was armor over. Not that she was proud, but that she was terrified and alone and finished. And that the only thing standing between her little girl and the cold and the county and the men she owed was Delia Rourke's absolute refusal to be seen as a woman who could be helped. Because to be helped was to be weak, and to be weak was to lose the child. And so she had chosen to freeze upright, rather than kneel and be saved. And then she said the thing, the hard thing, the heaviest thing she owned. She looked at Gideon Ware, and she looked at the child burning with fever in her arms, and she made the one choice her whole self was built to prevent, and she said it in a voice with nothing left in it. Please help her, please. Please, one word. It cost her everything she was. And I have thought in all the years since that I never saw a braver thing than that surrender, that a woman could carry armor up a mountain through a killing winter and then at the last choose to lay it down not for herself, never for herself, but because her child needed her to be a person who could ask. That's the morally heavy thing if you're keeping count. It wasn't the mountain. The mountain was easy. The heavy thing was the please. What we did after, I'll tell quick, because the doing was the easy part once the asking was done. Gideon Ware had that stovepipe up, and the stove drawing inside 20 minutes. The old pipe had rusted through and choked. That was the whole of it, $1's worth of iron between that child and the grave, and Delia had known it and had been too broke and too proud to fix it, and too far up the mountain to get down for the parts. He built a fire that could have warmed a church. I melted snow and Gideon showed me how to steam the room for the child's throat, hanging wet cloths near the stove, and we got broth into Delia a spoon at a time because she was near as bad off as the girl, and Gideon Ware sat up the whole night with that fevered child on his own chest, this enormous silent man with his oak slab hands, patting her small back through the coughing fits with a gentleness I did not know a body that size could hold, and once, near the grayest part of the night, I heard him say something to her, low, a word that wasn't the child's name, and I understood it was his daughter's name, and I turned my face to the fire and I did not let on I'd heard. The fever broke a little before dawn. The child slept, real sleep, easy breathing. Delia sat against the headboard watching her breathe like it was the only thing in the world, which for that hour it was, and Gideon Ware got up stiff from the bedside and went and stood at the little window and looked out at the snow going blue with the coming morning, and I saw his shoulders, and I let him be. We got them down the mountain 2 days later, when the storm had blown itself out and the sun came hard and bright off the new snow. Gideon carried the child most of the way, wrapped in his own coat, and he went bare-armed in that cold and never said a word about it. Delia walked. She'd not be carried, some armor stays, and I'd not have wanted her to lose all of it, for it was the same steel that had kept her girl alive. But she let me take her arm on the bad grades, and that from her was a kind of miracle, and I put it in my ledger. Harlow's Bend was different to her after that, and she was different to it, and neither happened the way the storybooks would have it. She didn't melt into a grateful, softened thing. She wasn't made for melting. But she took the room Mrs. Havorson offered for the winter, and she took the work Coyle put her to keeping his freight books, for she had a fine clear hand and a head for numbers, as I'd seen at the mercantile that first day, counting out her last coins like a general. And she earned her keep in June's, and she paid Mrs. Havorson back to the penny by spring, and she never once, that I heard, said the word charity like a curse again. Because Gideon Ware, up on that mountain in the dark, had shown her the one thing her armor had never let her learn, that letting a person help you carry a thing is not the same as being too weak to carry it. That sometimes the strongest thing a body can do is say please to the right man at the right hour. And Gideon Ware came down off his mountain more than 6 times that next year. He came down for salt and powder, yes. But he also came down, now and again, and sat on the bench outside Coyle's in the sun, and let June Rourke bring him a stick and demand he whittle it into a horse, which he did badly with those oak slab hands, and the child loved the bad horses more than good ones, and lined them all up on the windowsill of Mrs. Havorson's spare room, a little herd of crooked ponies, and I don't have the words for what it did to a man to watch Gideon Ware whittle a bad horse for a living child. 15 years he'd not let himself. She undid it a little, not all the way. Grief doesn't go all the way, but a little. I'll end where the ledger ends, because I promised you the end is what matters, and I meant it. Come spring, when the switchbacks opened, Delia Rourke went back up to the Ambrose claim. She'd not give it up, it was hers. She'd bled for it, but she went up different. She went up with the roof mended, because half the men who'd stood in Coyle's yard doing arithmetic that snowy night had ridden up in April with lumber and shingle and their own tools, and she let them. That was the change. Not that she needed less. That she'd learned to let herself be needed by, and to need, and there's not a hair's difference between the two once you're standing inside them. I asked her once, the day of the roof raising, why she'd fought us all so hard for so long, when in the end it was $1 of stovepipe and a night's fire that near cost her everything. She was up on the ladder handing down the old broken shingles, and she stopped, and she looked down at me, and the sun was behind her so I couldn't rightly see her face, and she said, "Because when you've got nothing left but the way you hold your head, Mr. Pratt, you hold your head." She handed down another shingle. I was wrong about what strength was. I'm not sorry I had some to be wrong with. And I wrote that in my ledger, in the column for things that are true, and under it I wrote one more line and then I closed the book, because some things you don't write down, you just go and do, and that April, for the first time in 7 years, I sat down and I wrote a letter to my mother's grave 200 miles off, and I told her I was sorry I didn't come home. And I told her I'd finally learned what she'd been trying to teach me the whole time she was wearing herself to the bone, and never once asking me to stay. Gideon Ware still comes down off his mountain. There's a little herd of crooked wooden horses on a windowsill that keeps calling him down. And Delia Rourke still carries her head high, up on her claim and her mended roof, and she always will, and I've stopped thinking of it as armor. I think of it now as a spine,